Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this special panel discussion about a looming national crisis over student loan debt. My name is Paul GRONDAHL. I'm the director of the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. We're proud to co-sponsor this event with filmmaker Mike Camoin. Mike is at work on a documentary titled Scared to Debt about the untold story of how the US government, the higher education industry, and a predatory lending system responsible for skyrocketing student loan debt, which in 2020 surpassed a record 1.6 trillion, that's trillion, owed by 45 million borrowers in the United States. Student loan debt is now the second highest consumer debt category, behind only mortgage debt, higher than both credit cards and auto loans. College students of the class of 2018 owed an average of $29,200, and that average student debt continues to rise to alarming levels with the cascading effects of fees, penalties, and other charges. To help us sort out this perilous situation for tens of millions of college students, their parents, and recent college graduates, I'll introduce our moderator for this panel discussion. Matt TAIBBI is an award-winning investigative reporter, a contributing editor to Rolling Stone, an influential podcaster, and the best-selling author of 8 books. TAIBBI and his wife endured their own nightmarish personal story about what he has termed the Great College Loan Swindle. As an acclaimed journalist, TAIBBI has reported on a wide range of topics and in many parts of the world, including in the former Soviet Union. His fiercely independent reporting has earned him the respect of fellow journalists and the wrath of repressive regimes and other powerful forces who seek to silence the free press and freedom of speech. In Moscow, TAIBBI co-founded an English language newspaper called The Exile, a satirical biweekly known for investigative journalism and practical jokes. TAIBBI overcame many obstacles to practice immersion journalism in Russia, where he worked as a bricklayer in Siberia, a moonshine dealer, a professional clown, an elephant keeper, and a professional basketball player. It's fair to say that Matt TAIBBI's journalism career contains multitudes, and he has never been afraid to speak truth to power. During his long and distinguished career at Rolling Stone, TAIBBI won the National Magazine Award for commentary, covered 4 presidential campaigns, dissected the 2008 financial crisis, and wrote penetrating, in-depth articles on the criminal justice system. His 8 books include The Great Derangement, Griftopia, The Divide, Insane Clown President, and I Can't Breathe, about the police killing of Eric Garner, which won wide acclaim. TAIBBI and his wife Jean have 3 sons, Max, Nate, and Zeke. They live in New Jersey. I'll now turn it over to our distinguished moderator, Matt TAIBBI.
Thank you, Paul, for that very generous introduction. I'm very honored and glad to be here at the Student Loan Town Hall. Thanks in part to a lot of the people who are involved with this affair today. I was led to look at the student loan issue some years ago for a series of features for Rolling Stone. And initially, I wasn't, I have to admit, terribly interested in the topic. I had been covering Wall Street for many years, and I didn't know a whole lot about student loans. I just thought it was a sad story from the outside and not something where there were a lot of misconceptions where somebody like me could really do a lot of good. But what I found after being turned on to the topic by people like Alan COLLINGE from studentloanjustice.org is that this is an extremely complicated affair that has been serially misreported in the mainstream press. There are a lot of misconceptions that exist, particularly throughout the mainstream media landscape about this topic. There's a lot of victim blaming, which is not a term I typically like to use, but the overarching narrative about this topic is that the people who get in trouble with student loans, it's their own fault. And I think that's why a project like a movie like Scared to Debt is so important, because it will remove that layer of contextualizing and myth making that has, I think, delayed progress on this issue. People out there, if you go to political rallies, you hear a lot of anger about this issue, I think, and it's increasing, but not among the decision-making class. And I think that needs to change. And that's why I think it's a great thing that projects like this are going forward. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike Camoin, the filmmaker and president of Videos for Change Productions, who is going to show us some clips, and then we're going to talk to some panelists afterwards. Mike?
Matt, thanks for having me, and thanks to Paul and the Writers Institute for hosting this. Like others, I was first introduced to the issue through Alan's book, The Student Loan Scam, the Most Oppressive Debt in U.S. History and How We Fight Back. After I read that book, I grew very angry. My wife and I have 2 children. We're about to put them through college in 2 short years. And I really began to wonder, is this a bad borrower problem or a bad lending system? And our research led me to introductions to people like you, Matt, and Alan, and others who have been reporting on this for years, collecting data on the student lending crisis. And I'm pleased to be able to join with others today. I've always been amazed that actually there are many voices on all sides of the political spectrum that are now helping us to paint a picture that is simply too complicated to put into a 3-minute news story. When I explain this issue to friends and colleagues, people in the media industry, about how consumer protections have been removed from student loans, their jaw drops. And my wife and I are still very scared about sending off our kids to college and signing on these loans. So I really hope to be able to launch this documentary in 2021. What folks will see in this upcoming clip is borrowers from Georgia, South Carolina, the West Coast, the Northeast, Cape Cod, Manhattan, followed by some of the folks that we've interviewed who have been also following this issue for many years, and some of whom are with us today. So if we can roll these first few scenes, and look forward to hearing all of you unpack what you see.
I still need to take out about $140,000 of student loans to finish my MIT degree.
My friends choose to be an engineer versus a fine arts major or anthropology major, even if that's your passion. Are you gonna spend $25,000 a year to do that, go into debt, and then not be able to pay that off in the future?
If you borrow and you're not able to pay back, it's your fault. You're not a good American. What's the matter with you? Why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps and pay it off? Be a grown-up. But it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that, and it's much more predatory than that.
The more they baffle and bamboozle and confuse and lose paperwork and confuse the borrower, turns out the more money they make.
Well, my application was denied because my spouse did not sign the form. My imaginary spouse. I did not have a spouse. Why? Because if you do not get your application approved, they can take all of the unpaid interest and then tack that onto your principal loan balance.
I just got off the phone with Navient. I signed off on the agreement, and then they're saying, well, it's not a finalized agreement, but they charged me.
30 years after the original signing of this loan, that $20,278 is now $136,000, with the current estimated payback of $212,000 next to my name. I'm 69 years old. The loan will die when you do. I would hate reading that on those bills.
I mean, that's like slavery.
It's the colleges causing their problem. It's the government causing this problem. It's Wall Street causing this problem. It's not these borrowers.
If you build a model that makes money on the failure of your children, then you are engineering the failure of the future itself.
That was a very, very moving clip, and I think there's a lot of themes that are worth exploring in there. So without further ado, I'm going to start turning it over to some of the people on our panel today. And I think we should begin with Alan Collinge of studentloanjustice.org, whose book and whose research is probably the reason that a lot of us got interested in this topic. Alan, what's your response to that clip?
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And let me just say, I'm so glad to see all these people that we've met over the years in filming the documentary and being interviewed about it and so forth here today. And, you know, that is, those people that interviewed are more the rule than the exception today. You know, when we first started this battle so many years ago, the sort of belief was that, you know, people who got sort of sideways on their student loans were the minority of borrowers, you know, 10 or 15%. It's sort of a sad backstory, a side channel. Well, in fact, I'm here to tell you now that even just before the pandemic, it came out that 80% of all student loan borrowers were never going to be able to repay their loans. So they're either delinquent, they were in default, deferment, forbearance, otherwise unable to pay, or they were paying, but their balance was going up. And it's also come out quite recently that the default rate for 2004 students, and these students were only borrowing about a third of what students are borrowing today, their default rate is 40%. So, and again, this was before the pandemic that this came out. So, you know, at this point, I have to say that this lending system it's catastrophically failed. It's over the cliff. And, you know, it couldn't be better timing for this film. And so that's why, again, I'm so glad to be here today talking about it.
Yeah, watching that clip, I remember the first time I did a story about student debt. And, you know, one of the things as a journalist that you look for when you first start looking into a topic is you interview as many people as you can, and then when you start hearing the same thing over and over again, that's usually an indication that, you know, that's an area you want to explore a little more. And the first thing that I noticed about interviewing people who had issues with their student loans is that basically all of the people that I talked to at some point or another came to the conclusion that they would never be able to touch the principal of their loans. And this is a story that you hear over and over again, people kind of heading into their 30s, even if they have successful careers, and coming to that realization that basically they're going to be battling with interest payments for the rest of their lives and not really making any progress towards ever getting the loan out of their lives. So those stories are really important to hear it from people themselves and to see how old people get before they can even reckon with this. So I think that's important. Anyway, I think we should move over now to another great participant, Catherine Austin Fitts, formerly of Sallie Mae, who's terrific on a lot of financial issues. And Catherine, what's your response to that clip?
First of all, I just want to say thank you to Alan, because Alan, it was your book that got me started on this. I had known how much corruption there was in the federal finances, but it wasn't until I discovered your work that I realized that, of course, it had happened in student loans. And I also want to thank Matt, who, whenever I deal with financial fraud, does a wonderful job of keeping me in a state of amusement. Anyway, I was on the board of Sallie Mae, and it was after I left Sallie Mae that I believe several of the board members got together and re-engineered the terms and conditions of student loan design in this country so that they could make more money from failure rather than success. And I would describe what happened next, and I've told you this, Ellen, many times, as a fraudulent inducement. And, you know, I would even argue that I don't think many of the student loans issued in the next 10 years after that happened in the late 90s are legal, because when I, as a lender, encourage you to take on debt, which I know you can't pay off because I understand what's going to happen in terms of changes in the economy through globalization, then I'm engaged in really an entrapment, an inducement. And And it is a very disturbing comment on the leadership involved in doing this, whether it's the leadership of the different endowments of the key schools who were part of this, whether it was the board of Sallie Mae that then made an absolute fortune privatizing in no small part thanks to these kinds of provisions and what it did to their profitability over time. I often hear, oh, we can't afford to change this. In fact, we can afford to change this. First and foremost, whenever a society, and this is true throughout history, approves and makes usury legal, it's simply a matter of time until that society fails. So it's absolutely essential that we reverse engineer this. And if you look at the amount of money that's gone disappearing from the federal government, so we have 21 trillion missing from federal accounts, but now we have massive tax relief bills in the latest administration, and we have trillions of dollars of stimulus. And what that's proved is we absolutely can afford to reverse engineer and get this situation right, which is why I can't tell you how much, Alan, I appreciate your efforts to try and reverse it, because we absolutely need a champion. But I think it really comes down to all of us. If we want to have a future as a people, this has to get reversed. I think it's so very important. And that's why, Mike, I appreciate the work you're doing on this documentary. I can't wait to market it to the Sallie Network.
Thank you, Catherine. That was great. And for another reaction, I think it's we can turn it over now to the executive producer of Scared to Dead, who also Tom BORGERS, who's also been recognized for his work on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. And this is someone who has a lot of expertise in this area of financial corruption. Tom, what are your first impressions from that clip?
I also want to thank Alan. You know, I've been working with Alan and Mike over the last going on 3 years now, and you know, I've been involved in many different crises, everything from the S&L and banking crisis of the late 80s and 90s, mid 90s, to 9/11, to billion-dollar financial frauds, and of course the financial crisis. And what really disturbs me about this, as being an advocate too, is that, you know, no one cares other than all of us, that all these millions and millions of parents and students are so overwhelmed with this debt, and it just boggles my mind that, you know, when I was involved with the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, and our job was to figure out what caused the financial crisis. You know, I could call up 60 Minutes, I could call up billionaires, and they pick up the phone and give me all the time. But with this crisis, no one wants to pick up the phone. And why? You know, tens of millions of these kids and parents are overwhelmed with this debt. And as everyone agrees, they should not have been given this debt in the first place. You know, as a banker, the very first thing you look at is the capacity of a person who borrows the money. And if the parent is making $30,000 or $50,000 a year, and you're giving, the parents have 4 kids, and they all want to send their kids to a better, you know, one of the best schools, you know, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And how could you give hundreds of thousands of dollars to a person making $30,000 to $50,000 is beyond me as a banker. And I you know, I really do think that the colleges, the universities, Wall Street, and the federal government, and the White House, and the House and the Senate are to blame, because, you know, those are the leaders. Those are the ones that are committing this predatory lending, and it should be stopped. You know, we're the only nation in the world that that doesn't support its young and give free education. And you know, we're not even talking about free education now. We're talking about, you know, relieving the stress off these people for trillion, 1.7 trillion dollars. So it's beyond, rationalized, as a Wall Street banker, and even, the head of the Fed agrees that he can't understand why we can't allow bankruptcy. But I don't think we should even give bankruptcy. We should just forgive these loans. And by forgiving these loans, we'll create the biggest increase in the economy for the working poor and the middle class in the history of our country. And this is a banker telling you this. And it's outrageous that we can't get any traction on this. And maybe with the election over tomorrow, we'll see a different response. And I think we will.
Yeah, Tom, that was great. And I think you bring up a couple of really important points there. Not only the irrationality of giving out that much debt to people who clearly can't pay back, but also, if you talk to the people who make these decisions, a lot of these are 18 and 19-year-old kids who have no education about the decision that they're about to make. We're essentially asking young people to make a decision that's as consequential to their financial lives as getting a mortgage, and they have no conception of what that is at the age that they're entering into this agreement, and it haunts them for the rest of their lives. So simultaneously, it's irrational from the point of view of I think the banks, or it should be, and it's also immoral.
Yeah, Tom hit it right on the head. And I know we'll be talking about solutions later, but I have to say, at this point in time, particularly in this pandemic, it's too late to return bankruptcy protections even to student loans. We fought very moderately for this for 15 years. And at this point, returning bankruptcy to the loans would really only ensure that 15, 20, 25, maybe even 30 million people and families would be compelled to file for bankruptcy. Now, I think we're a better country than that. I don't think that we want to go off that cliff. In an average year, less than 1 million people in total file for bankruptcy in the country. So bankruptcy is no longer a viable option.
Catherine, did you have something you wanted to add?
So I agree with everything that Tom and Ellen have said. I would return bankruptcy to new loans. I would wipe the existing loans off the book. And I would make sure that there's no tax liability for the wiping of those existing loans when you do it. So you need tax provisions here too, which makes the legislation a little more complicated. If you look at the stimulus or other financial fraud that's been going on in the federal accounts, this is a tiny cost relative to many of the other sort of monies that have been thrown around and flying around. So this is something we absolutely can afford, and there's no reason not to do it. This is straight politics. Do we want our kids to be basically serfs, or do we want them to be free? That's the issue.
We're going to move on now to the second clip, which I think is going to hint at some of the possible solutions to this crisis.
I worked in Congress for almost a decade. One of my first bosses said, the first rule in politics is never fix a problem until all your voters know that it's a problem.
You have people at the Department of Education and people in Congress who look at student loans and throw up their hands and say, it's just too much. We can't do anything for you.
The way you beat organized money and organized corporations is with organized people who know how to focus their votes on 535 members of Congress and turn them around so they represent the American people.
The powers that be won't be civilized and find a way to help young people out of this dilemma, then young people should fight back. And the way they can fight back is by refusing the burden.
300 to 400 people, all with torches and their student loan papers in their hands. We're going to burn our papers. We're going to throw those ashes in the harbor.
We need students to come together in a movement against government, against colleges.
That building behind us built this bubble. They inflated this debt balloon, and they need to take responsibility for it, and that's why we're here.
fighting for this cause and working to solve a problem is going to be so much more beneficial for myself and so many others that that's what I have to do now.
No one wants to listen, but we have to make them listen because this is the future of our country and this is the heart of our country.
When people see people like them are actually getting off the couch and even coming to Washington, D.C. to make sure that we get justice, I think that'll be very inspiring for others.
I guess we should maybe start with Alan, who figures a lot in some of that video. So is that your idea? I mean, you have that kind of Tea Party image there, kids are sort of rejecting this burden going forward. Is that a crucial element of what has to happen for this to change?
I unfortunately, Matt, and I hate to be here saying this, but I think that is the only viable option. You know, we've seen what Congress will do, what Congress will not do, and they've got to be pushed. And at this point, the only toothpick of power that we borrowers have left is the ability to refuse payment. And unfortunately, it's got to happen. Now, the good thing is that right now, almost nobody is paying on their student loans anyways because of this pandemic. But truly, I think the most rational way out of this is for the citizens to come together, hopefully more than 50%, hopefully 60, 70, 80%, and we can start this debt refusal. And so we've got a little bit of a wind at our backs at this point, and it's got to happen. I mean, there just is no other viable option.
Catherine, I guess the question for you is A, do you agree? And B, what do you think the consequences would be if people suddenly started intentionally not paying on that sheer quantity of debt? I mean, it's an amount that is close to the size of the pre-2008 mortgage subprime level. What's your take on what would happen?
So I think if you started to get a broad-based effort to stop paying, you would see the issue rise in importance and discussion, which would be a good thing. My question are there legal arguments that will give the people who stop payment leverage? So for example, let me suggest two. One is, as I said, I think that this was fraudulent inducement, certainly for the first 10 years after the bankruptcy provisions were removed. So if you look at the leadership who did this, they knew that with globalization that the incomes of these kids would not be there to pay these loans back. So they knew that this was fraudulent inducement, as did many of the universities, particularly the Ivy League universities. And so because part of the fraudulent inducement was not just on the debt side, it was on the curriculum side. You're encouraging kids to spend a fortune on curriculum that will never be economic given where the marketplace and the labor market is going. That's number one. Number two, for American students, every American student, the federal government is missing $65,000 per person of monies that have gone missing in the federal accounts. And one of the things I've suggested is why not, instead of simply not paying your student loan, assert a common law right of offset. So every student say, okay, you, the federal government, have gone missing $65,000 of my money. So up to $65,000, I'm going to assert a common law right of offset. Believe it or not, I did that with one of the big New York banks. I said, at the time, there was 14,000 missing, and I sent a letter to one of the big New York banks and said, you owe me 14,000, I owe you 14,000, I'm asserting a common law right of offset, I'm not going to pay you. And I never heard from them again. It was very interesting. So there are legal arguments, because if you look at the people who are responsible for this, whether it's the large lenders or the federal government, they are in multiple violations of the law on many, many different issues that affect the same people who will be tearing up their debt. So I think it's time to tear up the debt and bring on the conversation of who's liable for what. Because if you look at the criminal violations, and I'm laughing because nobody has documented them better than Matt. If you look at the criminal violations that those institutions are guilty of, I think the students come out looking quite well.
Tom, what's your response to this? I mean, I'm assuming we can predict what Wall Street would say in response to a campaign to forgive student debt or any kind of news story that would suggest that kids shouldn't pay back their loans. When things like that were brought up in the mortgage crisis, there were widespread cries of this would induce moral hazard, and we can't possibly allow even the suggestion of this to go forward. So I guess, again, A, what do you agree with what Alan and Catherine have said? And B, what do you think the reaction of the financial community would be to that?
Let's go back. Can you hear me now? Okay. Let's go back to the financial crisis. You realize that if we did not give the banks a break and hold them accountable for their gross negligence and fraud, all the banks in the United States would have failed in this country. So we gave them a free handout, and no one talks about that. I'm one of the few have, and I've spoken to billionaires about this when I said, I collected the data on the fraud of the banks in, for 2006, 7, and 8. And I said, there's enough fraud and gross negligence here that we could close all the banks in the United States, all the major banks. And the one thing the banks are very powerful, but the students are not powerful. I'm just afraid that, if we don't do this methodically and approach the White House, the House and the Senate, and everyone else involved, Wall Street, and say, hey, listen, we're going to organize this non-payment, but please do not, because if you work for the federal government and you have a bad student loan and you're not going to pay on it, they'll fire you. If you have, if you're a doctor, an attorney, or have a license, they could, in your state, pull your license. So we have to be very careful on how we organize this. And I think once, hopefully the new administration and the new Department of Education and Wall Street will listen to reason, but we have to be careful with the lives of the students, the parents, because if we do it and just say, hey, listen, just don't pay your loans, there could be repercussions, for these people forever, because I can tell you, other than a few people in this country who can get away with not paying their debt, students can't get away with not paying their debt. You're going to hold them, put their feet and their whole bodies in the fire.
So we have one more clip we're going to take a look at.
I think we are facing a student loan crisis in America.
We don't allow student loan debt to be discharged in bankruptcy.
Right.
I'd be at a loss to explain why that should be the case.
You're taking it from a legitimate business and operation to a scam.
I mean, that's like slavery. It was when I was in the research office that I brought to the attention of Congress fraudulent claims.
This is the big ugly secret. They make more money if you don't pay back the loan.
I talked to people who are, of Social Security collecting age, and it took them that long to figure out that this was a scam.
This letter claims she owes the U.S. Department of Education $224,414.50.
The federal government has become the most predatory lending institution in the country.
I regret ever co-signing that federal student loan. I've now learned that I'm one of 44 million people.
The top student loan watchdog has submitted a resignation letter writing that the Bureau has abandoned consumers.
Colleges get all of the benefit and none of the risk.
There's no one who really takes the side of the borrower and says, we are going to solve this problem.
We should not have suicide from student loan debt.
How is it that America is allowing this to happen?
Fox News needs to be covering this.
Where's that guy out there? Student loan. We got the message.
There's no bankruptcy protection. There's no statutes of limitations. $1.6 trillion student loan debt.
The moment students mobilize, getting politically engaged, you will see the media report on this, because the media covers power.
You picked a bad day for this.
Hey, we're diehards. We love this.
We like the guy who falls and starts over. Let's not take that away from these kids who gambled wrong on their education.
So that's a great clip. One of the things I think that is really frustrating about this story is that if you talk to the average person, even people who are politically active, like on the campaign trail, who are following candidates, you say, what do you think about what should be done about the student loan problem? And almost invariably, the first thing they say is, well, I think they should increase access to student loans. They should make it easier for young people to get access to student loans. That word almost always appears. But in reality, the problem is completely different. It's that there's too much access, and what happens is, the overabundance of availability of this sort of government-backed student debt becomes a scheme that allows colleges to perennially jack up their prices, and it's a never-ending sort of merry-go-round where the only loser is the borrower, and that's the cycle I think that's so frustrating. It's so difficult to break the mindset among the sort of average media consumer. Anyway, Alan, we should start with you. What are your thoughts about that clip and about the government's role in all of this going forward?
Well, I think you're right, Matt. It is the lending system that has enabled these loans to be not only weaponized against the citizens, but to become a hyperinflationary vehicle through which billions, trillions of dollars have been created out of thin air in the form of debt and put onto the citizens' back. And, I'm glad to see quite a few conservatives in the clip, this one and the last, because this is a bipartisan issue, or really a nonpartisan issue. I might point out that among all student loan borrowers, something like 40% of them identify as being politically independent, and about 20% identify as being Republicans. So, the knee-jerk conservative response of, hey, you borrowed the money, you should pay your loans. Well, those people are really shutting down the conversation. And most of them consider themselves to be conservatives, I might add. But here they are, whether they know it or not, probably not. They're actually perpetuating, defending, and enabling the worst big government lending monstrosity that this country has ever seen. I mean, Catherine said the Department of Education, if it were a bank, would be the largest bank on earth. And, not to mention, some of the government profits on this lending system are used to fund very liberal programs like Obamacare, and not to mention this funding stream ultimately winds up in the hands of these liberal colleges who are indoctrinating our youth and everything, the old conservative line. So the people that we find criticizing us truly are being useful idiots to perpetuate the very sorts of things that they claim to despise. And so that's a very tough nut to crack.
Catherine, what's your response to that? Do you agree with Alan about that?
So I would say it this way. I think that what's happening with student loans is only a part of a much broader effort to centralize political economic control in a way that's producing massive inequality. And it's very much engineered centrally. It's very much top down. And I think the question for all of us, whether it's student loans or many of the other things and the other groups concerned with inequality, is how can we gather to build the political leverage we need to? But I just want to say I agree with Tom that individuals have to be careful given the controls and leverage on them. But at this point, I have to say, having worked in Wall Street and Washington, I'm reminded of the great line from Dallas when JR told Bobby, no one gives you power, you take it. And I think inequality has been growing steadily as a result of very complex financial engineering and legal engineering. And the time has come for, we're not going to go to Washington and persuade anybody of anything. We have to engineer political leverage, and it's going to have to be, it's going to have to come bottom up, and we're going to have to fight power with power. So, this is war. This is a war, and we know in 2020 that war just got a lot more aggressive, and we're going to have to fight accordingly.
Tom, what's your idea about the best way to increase leverage? And I hope you also have a quote from Dallas that you can employ to make your case.
Well, I'll give you a quote later, but here's my point. And we're not talking about the universities. The universities and colleges, I have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with Alan, with Mike, with interviewing students and parents with these loans. And I have found out one thing. The financial aid department, which is supposed to be the banker really for the universities, only about 1 or 2% of all the parents have ever spent any time with the financial aid department, and they just tell them go to FAFSA and get the loan. They don't counsel them and say, hey, listen, you're making $35,000 a year. Oh, you have 4 kids and you wanted to send them to my Catholic university. Oh, it's only $65,000 a year. Oh, you can afford it. Oh, sure you can. You can afford it. And why aren't we so outraged with these universities and these colleges? They have been lobbying the federal government and telling the federal government, hey, listen, we're going to raise our tuition and we're going to buy these billion-dollar buildings and keep all these contractors working for a million years. We're gonna pay these tenured professors, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, but we're gonna teach your students with adjunct professors who only get paid $36,000 a year. I was an adjunct professor until I found out that they only wanted to pay me $36,000 a year and teach more than twice the load of the tenured professor. So we should be outraged with these universities. I mean, some of them have, 10, 20, 30, $40 billion in their endowment programs, their hedge funds, we can call it that. And we should be outraged about that. Why isn't anyone outraged with, the federal government and the universities? Putting Wall Street aside, we know how corrupt they are. But we think, just because you're a university, you're taking care of our students, you're taking care of our parents, and they're not. I have found, out of spending all these hours interviewing these parents and students, if I had the ability and the FBI still reported to me, I would say, hey, listen, I think we should arrest the president of this university, the president of that university, and also maybe even go to the White House or the Department of Ed at least and say, hey, listen, you're allowing this fraud to go on, this gross negligence to go on for years, and we got to do something about it. We got to be proactive with this and demand change.
One very critical point to be made here, particularly during this pandemic, it turns out that the president has all the executive authority he needs to cancel 85% of all student debt by executive order. So he wouldn't need to go through Congress. He wouldn't need approval. He wouldn't need congressional appropriation And oh, by the way, it would add nothing to the national debt. So in this time of pandemic where we're throwing 500 billion, a trillion maybe dollars out in the form of PPP loans, which don't need to be repaid, by the way, and which all add to the national debt, you know, there simply is no better way to stimulate the economy. I mean, really, as far as fiscal stimulus is concerned, this is the low-hanging fruit on the tree. I mean, there's no easier, cheaper, better, I would say better targeted way to stimulate the economy. You know, make no mistake, the Department of Education is out there. They have no desire or intentions of canceling any loans. You know, they make their living off not canceling loans. Like 99% of the public service loan forgiveness program, for example, has 99% of those borrowers are being disqualified out of the program. So Congress is a dead end. I hate to say it, but the president can get this done like tomorrow, literally.
Mike, did you have something you wanted to add to the discussion before we turn it back over to Paul?
Thank you, Matt, for moderating, and thank you to all the speakers. I wanted to just run through some things that I heard from Catherine, her suggesting forgiveness on the past loans, but including bankruptcy in a solution. I think that's really great, and it certainly helps me and my wife when we go to sign on these student loans, and it helps millions of other families. So I like that as a solution. You know, Alan, I've known you for 3 years, and you've never wanted students to burn their loans. You were always looking for a solution. You're always looking for a conservative solution, the return of bankruptcy, consumer protections, things that are found in the US Constitution. So the fact that you are at this point says volumes, to me anyway, that you're not seeing any other real solution that's offered to you. I want to thank Tom for saying, you know, his words of caution, because I still don't think people fully understand how complicated this issue is, and how Catherine, you know, takes us through a process in the documentary of how this started. And that's the thing I think people need to see, is understanding a historical perspective on this so they understand how we got here. And once they do that, then I think everybody can join in and say, wow, we're really screwing this next generation, and that needs to stop. So let's all fix it. Because, you know, as Alan points out, there are people on all sides of the spectrum just in this documentary that are calling for just fairness. And as Tom says, somebody's got to listen. Otherwise, we are backing a generation into a corner. I just want to applaud Paul and the Writers Institute, which loves education, you know, and here we are finding that, you know, universities are responsible, and they need to step up. So for the bravery to the Writers Institute for supporting this conversation, I hope that, you know, it can lead to people finding interest in this documentary. They can support us, support the completion, so we can tell a complete story and go even further in depth. You could tell that these folks love this subject and are passionate about and care about America and students. And we hope that our documentary can do the same thing.
I really appreciate the passion of this panel, the expertise. Matt TAIBBI has a platform, and he has written very penetrating, challenging articles on this topic. I'll say, as somebody who's at a state university, some of those, you know, criticisms hit close to home. I do think a public education, particularly SUNY system, has community colleges, is a value in the landscape of higher education. But no, nobody's immune from Tom's point at the adjunct system, and this kind of second tier system of employment has been a big issue, underreported for a long time. I think Ralph Nader, you know, as a veteran of so many important causes and movements, when he said the media covers power, and the only way you're going to get attention is to show the power of students. You know, students have led the spring uprising in the Middle East. They've led Occupy Wall Street. They've led Black Lives Matter. They've led civil rights movement. You know, throughout history, these groundswell movements are what get change. It's very hard to get, you know, the the lawmakers to make change unless they hear it from their constituents loud and constantly. And I think this film, Scared to Debt, is a great opportunity to raise that awareness and to build that kind of momentum. And I think all of you being part of the film and taking time to participate in this panel discussion can start bringing some sense of relief, hopefully, for these millions of students and parents. I think they do get the message when their first paycheck, such a big chunk, goes to paying this student debt, and they never catch up. It reminds me, I'm a journalist as well. I've written a lot about these rental furniture companies and these paycheck companies that are predatory lending, and you never get, to chip away at the principal. You just keep getting fees and fees and fees. There is an element of that in this industry. And, there's a time for reckoning coming on many issues in this society, and this is one of them. When you look at those numbers, they're staggering, and I think there will be a movement, and Mike's film will bring a lot of attention and give voice to the people. I mean, that image of Alan out in the driving rain, with this message, that was powerful, and I really look forward to seeing the completion of the film. We will show it at our Albany Film Festival, and hope you're able to finish it soon, Mike. But thanks everyone for being part of this. And the Writers Institute always looks to present voices all across the spectrum, regardless. It takes some tough swings at higher education, and we will accept that, and we'll have this conversation and hopefully be part of the change that will be coming.
Thank you, Paul.